Hello and welcome to BYJU'S IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at an article from the front page of the Delhi edition. Tensions have again escalated between India and China as a result of the fresh aggression that has been displayed by the Chinese PLA. Reportedly, this incident took place on the night of August 29th and 30th, and these incidents occurred near the Pangong Tso lake and the Wainganga mountain pass. According to the Indian Army, the latest incident took place at the south bank of the Pangong Tso lake and as well as at the Wainganga mountain pass. According to reports, troops belonging to the People's Liberation Army of China entered these areas claimed by India in an attempt to alter the status quo as a part of the ongoing tensions along the line of actual control in the Aksai Chin and Ladakh region. This latest incident comes just 2 months after major clashes took place between India and China at the Galwan River Valley. Between May and July, India and China witnessed a major face-off along the line of actual control, and both the troops were involved in a major military standoff at the Galwan River Valley, at the Pangong Tso lake, and as well as at the hot springs area. Following these tensions witnessed between May and June, a de-escalation process was underway for the last couple of months as per the consensus arrived at the military and diplomatic negotiations. But this latest incident threatens to disrupt the ongoing de-escalation process because reportedly the Chinese side has made another deliberate attempt to alter the status quo at the line of actual control. According to intelligence reports, the PLA has amassed a large number of troops along with heavy weaponry such as tanks and artillery guns near the site of the latest incident, and hence, in order to prevent the Chinese side from altering the status quo unilaterally, the Indian Army has challenged Chinese aggression and it has carried out a preemptive operation under which it has conducted a counter-mobilization of troops at the south bank of the Pangong Tso lake and as well as at the Wainganga mountain pass. Following these latest escalation in tensions, a brigade commander level meeting has been held between India and China at Chushul, and even though there has been no physical clash this time, the Chinese PLA has clearly made yet another attempt to alter the status quo as the de-escalation process was underway, and this could possibly be an attempt by the Chinese side to undermine the consensus that had been worked out recently through military and diplomatic negotiations. So to prevent the Chinese side from altering the status quo on the ground, the Indian Army has conducted a preemptive operation and it has counter-mobilized to directly challenge the PLA's aggression. In response to this, China has accused the Indian Army of illegally crossing the line and provoking tensions along the border. But Indian strategic experts believe that this could be a Chinese attempt to distract India from the large-scale road construction activities that are currently being undertaken in the Depsang Plains. Then in a related article on the same page, it has been reported that according to Indian intelligence reports, China has gained control of around 1,000 square kilometers of Indian territory in Ladakh. As per intelligence inputs provided by central intelligence agencies to the Government of India, China has carried out a systematic mobilization of troops and equipment along the line of actual control, stretching all the way from the Depsang Plains to Chushul. At the Galwan River Valley, where violent clashes took place between the Indian and the Chinese troops in June that led to the killing of around 20 Indian soldiers, China reportedly has taken control of around 20 square kilometers of Indian territory. Similarly, intelligence reports indicate that China has gained control of Indian territory around the Pangong Tso lake, around the hot springs area, and as well as around Chushul. And in total, China has gained control of around 1,000 square kilometers of Indian territory in Ladakh through systematic mobilization of troops and equipment. This aggressive action by China over the last few months is a direct violation of the disengagement process that had been earlier worked out under the special representative mechanism. China has failed to uphold its commitments made during talks between the special representatives, and the latest incidents around the Pangong Tso lake and the Chushul area is an attempt by China to alter the status quo at the ground level, and this has caused a lot of concern for the Indian government with regard to Chinese intentions. For the time being, the Indian Army has preempted any Chinese action at the south bank of the Pangong Tso lake and near the Wainganga mountain pass near Chushul, but we need to wait and watch whether these latest incidents will result in a further escalation of tensions between the two countries. Now let's take up the next article. The National Statistical Office has brought out India's GDP for the first quarter of this financial year. As per this data, India's economy has contracted by a massive 23.9%. This contraction in GDP growth has to be one of the worst contractions that the Indian economy has seen in several decades. The GDP numbers for the first quarter clearly bears the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and the lockdown. Experts estimate that India's GDP numbers for the next 4 to 6 quarters to also remain in the negative category, and this is likely to drag down India's annual GDP for this financial year into the negative category as well. The last time that the Indian economy contracted to this extent was back in 1979-1980, and most estimates are indicating that this is likely to be the worst ever contraction that the Indian economy has witnessed since independence. The data brought out by the NSO indicates the sectors that were massively hit during the lockdown, and this includes the construction sector, hotels, transport, trade and communication, and more importantly, the manufacturing sector. Even though agriculture has registered a modest growth of around 3.4%, the other key sectors of the Indian economy have taken a massive hit as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and the lockdown, and the crisis has been further aggravated because of the weak fundamentals of the Indian economy, which has been ignored by the government over the last few years. See, the pandemic and the lockdown has not only affected the supply side, but it has also affected the demand side, because private consumption has hit an all-time low because of the pandemic and the lockdown. And even while the sale of essentials such as food items, groceries, drugs, etc. has gone up significantly, the sale of several non-essential items had come to a standstill during the lockdown, and it is only picking up slowly, and this has become one of the biggest drag factors on India's GDP growth. Sectors such as real estate, tourism, travel, clothing, hospitality, automobiles, etc. that are heavily dependent on private consumption have been severely hit because of the fall in demand for non-essential items. This demand contraction existed even before the pandemic and the lockdown, and it has been accelerated exponentially because of these events. But unfortunately, the various measures announced by the government, they are largely focused on the supply side, and they have been designed to revive production. Whereas over the last 5 months since the lockdown, the government has done precious little to revive demand, and this has subsequently led to a significant fall in government's tax revenue collection as well. If you compare India's performance since the pandemic with that of other countries, India's GDP contraction stands out as one of the worst, and this is primarily because the government has been hesitant to address the demand side contraction because of its excessive focus on keeping the fiscal deficit under control. But the world over, it has been recognized that if there was ever a time to breach the fiscal deficit, it is now, because the pandemic and the lockdown have severely affected supply and as well as consumption around the world. So those governments which borrowed heavily from their central banks in order to incentivize the revival of demand, they have performed exceptionally well as compared to governments which addressed only the supply side constraints and those that were solely focused on fiscal deficit and tax revenue. This is exactly what has happened with India over the last 5 to 6 months, and the drastic fall in demand has pushed the Indian economy into a vicious cycle. Most economic experts agree that one short way of coming out of this vicious cycle is to increase government spending without worrying about the fiscal deficit for now, because that would help in reviving demand and as well as in increasing government's revenue collection. Now let's take up a column from page number 8. In this column, the writers are evaluating the issue of GST compensation that the centre is legally and constitutionally bound to pay to the state governments. See, 3 years ago, the Government of India introduced a major reform in indirect taxation, that is the goods and services tax. The objective of GST was to provide for a one nation, one tax model with regard to indirect taxation. It was designed to abolish the multiple indirect taxes that were being imposed at the centre and the state level and replace it with a uniform single tax. So as a part of the GST system, the state governments agreed to let go of sales tax and a few other taxes that were imposed locally at the state level, and the center agreed to give up excise duty, service tax, etc. So the implementation of such a uniform indirect taxation system was expected to increase revenue collection and create a foolproof tax compliance system that could eliminate inefficiencies and promote the interstate movement of goods without facing the barrier of multiple indirect taxes. It was basically meant to be a destination-based consumption tax which would include all goods and services with very few exceptions. But the transition to such a rationalized taxation system was expected to create a huge shortfall in revenue for the state governments. And hence, in order to compensate the states for this shortfall in revenue due to the implementation of GST, the center promised to provide them with a compensation, and this was supposed to be funded with the imposition of a special cess known as the GST compensation cess. So as per this commitment, every year the center is supposed to transfer this compensation amount to the state governments in order to bridge their shortfall in revenue. The center was expected to fulfill this commitment at any cost in the interest of federalism, especially cooperative federalism. Because under the GST system, states were becoming excessively dependent on the center in order to meet their expenses and maintain their financial stability. But contrary to this commitment, the center has held back on paying this compensation amount, especially over the last 1.5 to 2 years. Due to the faulty implementation of the GST and due to the inherent flaws in the GST system, the revenue collection has gone down for the center, and as a result, the center had been delaying the payment of compensation amount to the states over the last few months, and currently there is a huge outstanding due amount that it owes to the state governments. This failure of the center to fulfill its commitment with regard to the compensation amount was already affecting state finances even before the pandemic, and hence a number of states were threatening to drag the center to the Supreme Court on this matter. But now, the pandemic and the loss of revenue to the government has led the center to express its inability to pay these dues, and recently the finance minister even went to the extent of declaring the pandemic as an act of God, which could help in invoking the force majeure clause under the contracts law in order to essentially declare the contract as null and void under such exceptional circumstances. This controversial statement by the finance minister has led to a massive uproar amongst the state governments, because by declaring the pandemic as an act of God, the center might be considering to invoke the force majeure clause, which would allow the center to go back on its contractual commitments. This essentially means that there is a possibility that the center might abdicate its responsibility with regard to the payment of GST dues to the state governments. This loss of revenue to the states comes at a time when their expenditure has gone up significantly as they are at the forefront of fighting this pandemic. See, it is absolutely understandable that tax collection has fallen as a result of weak economic factors that have been triggered by the pandemic and the lockdown. So the center's inability to pay the compensation amount to the state governments is quite understandable. But the problem is that the center is failing to acknowledge that its payments to the state governments even before the pandemic were pending, and the center had clearly failed to clear the dues even before as well. Then moreover, this is a time when the state governments need more financial support in order to increase their expenditure, especially towards healthcare, in order to battle the pandemic that is currently raging in the country. At this crucial juncture, the center has not only washed off its hands in the fight against the pandemic, but it is also looking to threaten state finances in order to secure its own financial position. This is where the writers point out that the GST mechanism is in dire need of major reforms, and the center needs to understand that states have very limited options to raise finances in order to strengthen their financial position and meet their expenditures and obligations, whereas the center has multiple options to raise such finances in a safe manner. For example, if the center needs to shore up its financial position, it can raise fresh finances by issuing a sovereign bond or by obtaining a loan from the RBI against the shares of public sector units, etc. Such financing options are not easily available to the state governments. So by placing the onus on the state governments, the center is essentially abdicating its responsibility, and it is pushing a number of state governments into a state of dire crisis. So the writers argue that the onus lies on the centre to fulfill its obligations under GST, and at a time when the nation's economy is suffering because of the pandemic and the lockdown, there is an urgent need for the centre to also provide for a fiscal stimulus so that demand can be revived, which will further improve tax collection, which in turn could help the centre to fulfill its obligations to the state governments. The writers also point out that ensuring overall macroeconomic stability is the responsibility of the centre, and by going back on its commitments to the state governments, the centre is not only threatening state finances, but it could also be threatening the country's macroeconomic stability. In this context, the writers suggest a few measures through which tax collection can be increased, and they cite the example of Australia in this regard. They argue that Australia has successfully provided for a one nation, one taxation system by implementing a standard rate of 12% for all goods, whereas India's GST has been very inconsistent with varying rates for various goods, and this could be one of the reasons behind the low tax collection under the GST. So the writers suggest that the implementation of a standard rate can help in widening the tax base, and it can lead to greater tax buoyancy that would in turn increase revenue collection for the centre, which would make it easier for the centre to meet its obligations to the state governments by timely paying the compensation amount. Next, the writers also argue that the GST system has to be completely overhauled and reformed in order to provide for greater autonomy to the state governments in certain categories, and they also make a case for an allocation to be made to the third tier of the government, that is the panchayats and the municipal bodies. They argue that if the GST system is not reformed, and if the centre fails to meet its obligations to the state governments, then it could erode the principle of federalism and cooperative federalism, as it places the states at the mercy of the centre, and hence they make a case for structural reforms so that the GST system can be fine-tuned for the long term. Now let's take up another column that is written by former Union Environment Minister Jayanti Natarajan. In this column, she argues that the subject of environment protection should be treated as a national issue by all the political parties, and it should not be seen through the lens of ideology and politics. She argues that all political parties, they need to keep aside their political and ideological inclinations and affiliations, and they need to treat the subject of environment protection as a national issue. See, of late, the government has been facing a lot of criticism over some of its policies, such as the draft EIA notification, and it has been accused by few political parties and by few sections of the society for being anti-environment in its approach. So in this context, recently the Congress President Sonia Gandhi had written an article in the Hindu itself, which was extremely critical of the government, but Jayanti Natarajan runs a counter argument by stating that any criticism of the government's policies cannot be done on political and ideological basis, especially when the issue that we are dealing with is environment protection. She argues that on the subject of environment protection, any government or any political party will have to strive towards striking a balance between the conflicting objectives of environment protection and economic development. And any criticism of such government policies will have to be constructive in nature, and it cannot be done on the basis of ideological and political affiliations. To counter the political stand taken by Sonia Gandhi, Jayanti Natarajan points out that evaluating India's performance solely on the basis of international indices, such as the Environmental Performance Index report, may not be the right benchmark, as these indices tend to miss out on the local context. See, the Environmental Performance Index has been developed by two top American universities, that is the Yale and the Columbia University. It is brought out by the World Economic Forum and the European Commission, which is one of the principal organs of the European Union. This index and this report is considered as a gold standard when it comes to evaluating a country's performance with regard to environment protection. But over the years, especially between 2006 and 2018, India's ranking on this index has consistently declined, and in 2018, India was ranked in the bottom 3 list with a rank of 177 out of 180 countries. But however, India's ranking has again improved relatively to 168, and she uses this argument to point out that India's ranking had fallen under the previous government as well. So solely evaluating government policies from the ideological and political prism may not be the best approach while dealing with a national issue. She argues that the subject of forest and environment was shifted from the state subject to the concurrent list through the 42nd Amendment Act in order to highlight the shared responsibilities between the center and the states when it comes to environment protection. So when it comes to environmental issues such as smog, air pollution, water pollution, tribal rights, especially that of forest dwelling communities, protection of wildlife, protection of habitat, etc., we need all the stakeholders to work in an unbiased, non-partisan manner, and this includes the central government, the state governments, the local bodies, the environmental activists, environment-related NGOs, and more importantly, the opposition parties as well. Then of course, when it comes to environment protection, one cannot ignore community participation, and hence the writer argues that all these stakeholders, they need to look at environmental policies and the subject of environment protection as a national issue, and they should not look at them from the perspective of political ideologies. Now let's take up the practice questions for today. The Renati Chola dynasty ruled over which region? The correct answer is option B, the Rayalaseema region, which is a part of today's Andhra Pradesh. This question has been asked because we have an article on page number 10 that makes a reference to an inscription that has been recently unearthed in the Kadapa district of Andhra Pradesh, and this inscription dates back to the Renati Chola dynasty that ruled over the Rayalaseema region of Andhra Pradesh. Now let's take up the next question. Which of the following statements are correct? The Wainganga river originates in the Mahadeo hills in Madhya Pradesh. It is a key tributary of the Godavari. It drains Madhya Pradesh and Maharashtra. It joins the Varda river to form the Pranahita river, which in turn empties into the Godavari river. All the given statements are correct. Option D is the right answer. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 13, Madhya Pradesh has received excess rainfall during the monsoon season, and as a result, rivers flowing in central India, such as the river Wainganga, they are overflowing and they are causing floods in the state. See, the Wainganga river is a major tributary of the Godavari, and it originates in the Mahadeo hills of Madhya Pradesh. It flows through Maharashtra and Madhya Pradesh. It joins the Varda river to form the Pranahita river, and then later it merges with the Godavari. Now let's take up the next question. Which of the following statements are correct? Virtual reality or VR offers a simulated experience that can be similar to or completely different from the real world. It finds application in entertainment, education, and as well as in simulated military training. Horizon is a social VR experience platform being developed by Microsoft. Amongst the given statements, the third statement is incorrect, so option B is the right answer. See, according to this article on page number 14, Horizon social VR platform is being developed by Facebook, not by Microsoft. And a virtual reality platform will try to simulate the experience of the real world, or as well as that of a fictional imaginary world. VR technology is an immersive technology that allows the user to intuitively experience a simulated world, and this technology finds numerous applications in the world of entertainment, especially gaming, movies, etc. It can be used for educational purposes, and it can also be used for military training through simulations. Now let's take up a practice question from the 2015 prelims paper. With reference to the Indian economy, consider the following: bank rate, open market operations, public debt, public revenue. Which of the above are components of monetary policy? The correct answer is option C. Bank rate and OMOs, or open market operations, they are a part of the monetary policy of a central bank, whereas public debt and public revenue, they are a part of the government's fiscal policy. Finally, let's take up a couple of mains practice questions. The first question: the issue of GST compensation is affecting state finances and is eroding the federal structure. Critically evaluate and suggest measures to address the challenge. The second question: to view environmental protection through an ideological or political lens will only spell its doom. Discuss. So kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the comment section below. So this concludes our discussion for the day. Thanks for watching.